How can we speed paint these stealthy boys? From this to this. Without an airbrush. Stick around and I will reveal all. It all began when I sold my warp spiders. Which is nice because I made some money, but also bad because now my Eldar army is down a unit. Today we are going to make up for that loss and also patch a missing troop choice by knocking out another unit of Eldar Rangers. This will also be a good opportunity for another of my experiments in painting camouflage patterns. Eldar Rangers, of course, are sneaky stealth boys who appreciate a bit of camo. I am in a bit of a hurry too because I want them painted for a game in a few days. So we will also try out some of my speed painting hacks on them. First up, I have to fix them up a bit. These Rangers are an eBay rescue. You can see they are not the current kit of plastic Rangers. They are the old metal Rangers of the old Hammer days. Actually, they are quite nice sculpts, but the previous owner had some ideas for converting their funny hairdos by chopping off their top knots. Presumably he was going to sculpt something else on top of that. However, he never completed his ambition, instead reselling them with chunks gouged out of their heads. Before we can paint them, we have to fix them some new hairdos. I am by no means a wizard at sculpting, but hair does not seem to be too hard to do, so I'm willing to have a go. My green stuff is a bit old and it is a pain to use anyway, so this time I'm going to use Milliput. I plop a little ball on their heads and then use a cocktail stick to push the putty around into the rough shape of a hairdo. Once I have the rough shape, I press into the putty's sharp lines to create a texture that suggests hair. I do this with my knife blade, as this has a finer edge than a cocktail stick. I sort of feel Eldar, as the posh boys of the 40k, would probably comb their hair a bit. So I try to put the texture in particular directions as if combed, and also I press in a side parting. That'll do, not too bad, but we will see how they look painted. Sculpting hair is one of those little hobby jobs that can be intimidating if you have never done it before. These models' previous owner presumably felt that way, and that is why he did not remedy the mutilation he inflicted. I find that whenever I feel intimidated about a particular hobby project, I am probably being hung up with prissy perfectionism like a pansy space elf. It is a performance anxiety that holds me up. The solution is to channel one's inner orc and just have a go, not caring that much how it turns out. Orcs never lose a battle, because if they win, they win. If they run, they can fight another day. And if they die, then they die doing what they love best. Fighting! This is the way of the orc, and it is great for screwing up the courage to screw up and not care. If you win, you win. If you lose, then you learned something about how to do it better the next time. Okay, so now I have the Rangers all cleaned up and based. Time to paint. The first layer of paint should be a primer. A paint which is specifically formulated to stick well to metal and plastics. Ordinarily, we would just cover the whole model with primer in spray form, either by aerosol can or through an airbrush. But I am not going to do that today. No, I am going to do a mad experiment instead. I am going to combine priming and base coating into one step using my patented sticky base coating technique. I already made a video about this technique and its pros and cons. You may see here. There will be a link to it in the video description as well. You can also find it on my channel page. Here I'm going to take this speed hack to the next level and also show how to follow up on it to complete a paint job. In order to combine priming with base coating, we need a largish range of differently coloured primer paints that we can apply with a brush. For this, I am using Vallejo's range of coloured surface primers, which are formulated for the airbrush. However, they can be applied by a regular brush just as well. Vallejo's range of surface primers does not have a huge range of colours, but I have a few workarounds for that which I will get to later. The first step in sticky base coating is to use a black primer to paint what I call the macro shade. This is the areas of the model that we want to look completely in shadow. For these ranges, that will be the underside of their arms, legs and body, as I am going with a classic overhead zenithal imaginary light source. These areas will be done with this one coat, so it wants to be a matte black rather than a gloss black, because shadows are not shiny. Now we can brush on the various coloured primers for base coat of all the lit or partly lit areas of the model. If I do not have the exact colour I want among the surface primers, then I just use the closest to it. I will shift the colour about later. For example, there is not a primer in a Caucasian skin tone, so I would either use a light grey or skeleton bone primer, then later tint it nearer to a flesh colour. I'm using the grey because I feel Eldar would be super pale. These rangers have a few bits of armour show. I want these to be in Craftworld Alatop colours, which is yellow and blue, but also I want it looking metallic. So I'm priming the armour and also helmets in the Vallejo's plate metal surface primer. Later I will tint this metal base with a glaze of yellow for the helmets and blue for the shoulder pads and breastplate to create a very metallic looking colour. I'm using a red primer on their hair and also some of the gloves and leather pouches. In both cases this red is a bit bright as it is, so I will mute them down with later layers of a reddish brown. I'm making them ginger mingers because in my headcanon Eldar are almost always red haired. We rarely see craft worlds without their helmets, but they are exactly the same race as the Dark Eldar, and they are always seem to have red hair on their box art. I am thinking of Hellions, Scourges and Witches of course. I don't see any good reason for why the craft worlds would be significantly different unless it was Dark Eldar fashion to dye their hair red. You can also see that I am using a variety of colours to paint their clothing. Brown, grey, olive green and red, and that I am mixing up bits of clothing, and that I am mixing up which bits of clothing get which colour. For example, some gloves are grey, others are brown, green and red. This is because I don't see rangers as regular uniformed troops. Maybe their armour comes from their craft world's army, but otherwise their clothing be of their own personal attire, and that would vary by personal taste. I am almost done priming them now, except I have done nothing for their camo cloaks yet. This is where I get extra experimental. So far I have been brushing on the primer to make block colours for each part of the model, such as hair, guns, trousers and so on. Now I want to try painting the camo patterns themselves in a single pass of surface primer. In this way I am combining priming, base colour and pattern painting into one step. Crazy! I've picked out 4 of the primer colours that I think will make decent colours for camo. Green, leather brown, Russian green and German dark yellow. Nice camo colours are generally earthy or natural colours with fairly low saturation. Ideally they want to contrast with each other in hue and tone too. I'm starting with green primer and painting little marks right onto the bare metal. I try to paint different marks on each cloak so that again they do not look too uniform. What are the chances that these rangers all shopped at the same army surplus store? Next I will pick out another colour and start painting marks on the remaining bare metal. I cycle through all the colours until all of the metal canvas is covered in something. It turns out not to be so easy as I thought though. The more the cloak fills up with pattern, the less visible the gaps become. It is important here to keep turning the model into the light so that any little gaps are shown up by their shininess. This probably wouldn't work so well with plastic though. So there we have the rangers are all primed and at the same time fully base coated and even have their camo pattern done. The final step of the sticky base coating method is hue shifting and touching up. With only a limited array of colours available as bottled surface primers, some of the base colours are not 100% where I want them to be yet. These colours need to be shifted a bit in hue and tone. Most noticeable is the colours I have used for their hair and skin. This is where I apply thin layers of a reddish brown over the bright red primer to mute the saturation down, to make the hair look more natural. I also brighten up the metal primer for the armour and helmets with a light layer of pearlescent ink. I then glaze over the metal with yellow and blue to colour tint the metal. For the few bits of skin showing, I mix a bit of Caucasian skin with white and then thin to a glaze to paint over the grey primer. I have not seen a Caucasian paint that was not a bit oversaturated. Compare this paint with my own skin. This is no problem because it is easy enough to desaturate a colour. Just mix in a little bit of white, grey or brown or black. I am not one for torturing myself painting eyes with visible whites. On 28mm scale models, that is almost guaranteed to look bad. A thin horizontal brown or black line bisecting the eye gives a nice suggestion of an eye quickly and painlessly. Think how much of the whites you can see of a person's eyes from a distance. And if a person is squinting, one thing I do put on is some eyebrows. It is remarkable how many very skilled painters will leave off eyebrows even while killing themselves to dot on irises and pupils that line up. I also do a bit of lining with thinned brown ink into various places just to strengthen the recesses. About now, I'm calling the sticky base coating stage done. We have blocked out the colour with primer and then touched up and shifted any colours that were not quite right with just the primer on its own. It is looking almost done, but yet also still a little flat. We have still the macro shade with the black primer, but otherwise there is very little suggestion of the model interacting with ambient light. We want to shade it up now in a more fine and more subtle way than the stark initial macro shade. If you are in a hurry or just lazy, you could just dunk them into a wash and call it done. But with just a little extra work, we can make these look really good with another technique I call the shadow glazing technique. Shadow glazing is where we paint a dark grey glaze into the recesses and partly shaded areas to create very realistic looking shading. A lot of miniature painters don't really seem to get how shadows work. They shade yellow with orange and highlight red with pink. One of my early videos tackled that issue and ruffled quite a few feathers in the process. See here if you like. In truth, shading is really easy. A well-lit surface will have its colours at its most vivid. As the light dims, though, the colour does not just get darker, it also gets more desaturated, losing the hue, as your eyes receive less information to help it work it out. Eventually all colours become shades of grey. You've heard the expression, all cats look grey in the dark? To be clear, we do not want to paint an opaque grey over our colour. We want some of the underlying colour to show through, just in a muted, less vibrant form, to simulate that the surface is receiving less light and our eyes are thus less able to resolve the colour. This is why I use a glaze of dark grey. A glaze is translucent, so some of the underlying colour will show through, even as the dark grey will mute and desaturate it. It can be fairly universally applied to shade any colour too, with only two exceptions, black and white. Of course, dark grey is no shade on black. Your brain represents the total lack of detected light as the colour black, so it has no shade below that. White can be shaded, of course, but it wants a very light touch of glaze, or a lighter shade of grey, or else the shading would look too strong. Shadow glazing is especially great for quickly shading complex patterns like on these camo clothes. Imagine how many painters would be thinking they should put a dark green on the green, darker yellow on the yellow, darker brown on the brown, when in fact all we really need to do is glaze a layer of dark grey in over everything in one pass. Super simple, and it looks far more realistic. So there we go, 5 Eldar Rangers in camo, speed painted, but yet looking really very pretty good, and even quite realistically shaded, using not one but 2 novel painting techniques. But I hear you wonder, exactly how speedy was it? Truth be told, I did not bother to time it, but it did feel like it did not take very long at all. Tell me in the comments what you think about that. And if this video was interesting or useful to you, then you could also prime that like button and shade that subscribe button for a chance to see more of my videos. If you are interested in camouflage patterns in particular, then you may want to check out my camo painting playlist here. Until we meet again, old chap, bye for now.